the scene that I rendered from the front, and I've just disabled everything except the HDR. So what you're seeing now is a scene that was set up exactly like the previous scene, except now the character has all the correct shaders applied. So once again, if I zoom in here, you can see that the chest blend, like the scratch map, is behaving the exact same. If I sample the arm material here, you can see that once again the blend material, the scratch map has just been created the exact same. There is one difference though on a couple of the pieces on this shader, and you'll see that what I've done is if I go to the diffuse part, once again same, it's a V-Ray dirt. In Photoshop I've gone in and added a couple of small decals in Photoshop. So if I go back to Photoshop here and load the arm texture, you'll see that everything's the same. However, where I've added those decals, which are quite simple to add, you can type in literally anything you want. So I could go in and add something even more to this and just like say type a number. But when I go in and add those decals, what I do is in the reflection slot of the texture, I make sure to go in and drag it into that, because I always like to add the decals at the end of the process after I'm happy with the overall workflow being like fully implemented. So I'll go in and that's where I'll just add in a couple of decals just to finish off the last, the last stage of the texturing process. So when you add the decals into the diffuse pass, I always like to go in and drop the reflection on those areas, because what that does is it makes them more visible because they're picking up less highlights. So just make sure that whenever you're adding the decals to the surface to go in and do that. And you'll see that when I go to the reflection, they line up now. Same for all the other decals. I've just literally copied them over and dropped the reflection amount. Okay, the other interesting thing on the arm shader here is that you're seeing, on the fingers, is that you're seeing some areas that are glowing. So if I go to the beauty pass, you'll see that the fingertips and inside these crevices are glowing. So to achieve that effect, it's quite simple. Let me just sample the fingers here. You see I've got the base material set up the exact same. I've got the scratches set up the exact same. But then on the top of this, I've got a glow material. And if I unhide this, you can see it's a simple V-Ray material with a slightly red diffuse. And let me actually just drag this glow out into a separate layer. And I'll apply this to the whole fingers. And I'll just render this off for you so you can see what it looks like just as the shader itself. So fairly simple. You can see in the color there's some slight variations between warm yellow and red. And I've done that just to simulate that kind of flowing lava effect. On top of that, I've still got a lot of reflectivity on the surface. And you'll see once this finishes, the glow effect just adds a nice last little level of heat to the surface. So you can see when rendered on large areas, the shader doesn't really hold up in terms of being realistic. But the beauty is we're only adding this shader into the fingertips themselves. So in order to do that, you need a mask to put this in. So what I've done is if I go back to the hand shader and go to the blend map for this, and I'll go to the perspective viewport and just show you. You can see the textures being blended in the crevices and the fingertips. So to do that, what I've done is in ZBrush, I've gone to the hand model. I've filled the mesh with a pure white color by just going fill object. So color, fill object. And then from here, what I've done is I've turned on RGB and turned off ZAdd, so, because all I want to do is polypaint. And then I've just gone into the fingertips. And if you turn L, it will turn off this. If you hit L, it will turn off that loop selection thing. I'm just going to make the background not blend through. I'll just paint it in the fingertips like so with a solid color. So then from here, if you hold shift down, you can blur the polypaint data, but once again, make sure that when you do that, you turn off ZAdd. And now I'm just going to make the brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to go down to the lowest subdivision on the geometry, which is going to make blending this a little bit easier. And I'm just going to hold shift and blur this. Just like so, and very quickly you can see I've just generated that map. Now I'm going to go up to the higher res version again. And from here, I'm going to go to texture map, and I'm going to create a new one from the polypaint data, like so. I'm going to hit clone texture up the top here, like we did with the diffuse map. I'm going to flip it and then export it. And I'm going to call it hand blend map. I'm going to load that map into Photoshop. You can see like so. And now I've just got to invert that texture. So we've got the fingertips blending in, but I don't have the little crevices. So this is where I need to load the cavity map data for the hand that I've generated earlier. So you can see I've loaded the cavity map and the occlusion map, and I apologize, but I got it wrong earlier. I've actually used the occlusion map to blend things in here. So the first thing I want to do is, you can see there's not enough contrast in the occlusion map itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and just adjust the exposure and then increase the brightness. And now we're getting a little bit more contrast in those areas. I'm going to make this an 8-bit map now, setting it to exposure and gamma, and I'm just going to invert the image, like so. Now I can bring this over the top and screen things in. And I only want the areas of the map visible on just certain parts. So this is where I need to hand paint a mask in for where I want the little crevices to go. So once again in ZBrush, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the texture off and go color fill object twice. And sorry, I've just got to make sure I've got that on white. And now with the black shader applied, once again, I can paint in where I want where I want the different parts of this to blend in. So for each texture, I'm just going to blend in around here. I don't have a tablet when I'm doing this because I want to prove that you don't need a tablet for any of the parts of this texturing workflow. See, it's just very rough because this is only going to be a mask for Photoshop to define where that occlusion map is being blended. And once again, I'm going to go create, new from Polypaint, clone it, flip it, and then export it. And I'm going to call this heat blend. I can just load that texture. I'm going to flip it once again. I'm going to bring this over the top. I'm going to hit Control A and Control C, and then I'm going to create a mask for the occlusion layer down here with the mask tool. I'm going to go into the channels, hit Layer 1 mask, and I'm just going to paste that information in. And just like so, you can see that I've got that being blended in there. Now I'm just going to apply the layer mask, and any areas that are a little bit messy here, I'm just going to clean those up by erasing them. Like so. So obviously for the main parts of the texturing, like I was saying, there's no hand painting done, but when you've got to deal with specific stuff like this, you can't avoid it. So just be prepared for that. But it's not like you need to be very artistic with this phase. It's just a matter of going in and doing the work, you know what I mean? You don't need to be an amazing painter to go in and do this stuff. So I'm going to go in now and make a curve adjustment on this just to brighten things up a little bit more. And I'm going to save this map out. I'm going to call this hand heat blend map. And see what this looks like in Max. But before I do that, I'm just going to duplicate the shader just so I've got the old one there. And there you go. You can see that we've got that blended in. Only where we want it. It's fairly simple. So now if I go in and render this, you can see that the thickness on these crevices is maybe a little too strong. So once again, let me just cancel the render and I'll go in Photoshop and drop down this blended in layer a bit more You can see as I drop that down, it gets a little bit crispier. And I'll resave that off. It's little details like that that do make all the difference. And I'll just hit reload here. You can see now that reducing the amount of light coming through just makes things look a bit nicer in terms of how they're being blended. Okay, so moving on. Also, what's happening in the hand shader is if I go outside here, just sample that again. In the diffuse slot, you can see that I've got an unoccluded texture and an occluded texture. And if I go into the diffuse slot of the occluded texture, I've basically just used the grime map to generate a dusty kind of brown material. And all that's happening here is the dirt map is defining where that's getting blended in. So I can go into Photoshop. Let me just close these down. And I'm just going to load in the source text. So to generate this map, I can basically just utilize kind of some of the layers in here. So I'll just put this on screen. I can enable the grunge map, and if I just add a hue and saturation adjustment to that and hit colorize, I can darken that off like so. And I can save that off. And that's basically all I've used for the diffuse. I might have tweaked at some point the coloring just a little bit. So you can see just going in here, darkening off a bit more. But overall, because it is being blended in such a small area, and I'll just show you that, what I'll do is I'll go from the camera angle. And if I load up that last render and go to the diffuse map, you can see here that it's being blended in where the occlusion is happening. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make a huge difference to the overall appearance. It's just at high res, it gives it a little bit more of a dusty feel in those areas. So I've made maps like that for the legs. And sorry, let me just delete these because I didn't end up using them. So for the legs, I've ended up blending in a little bit more of that dust in the occlusion, but all the other pieces don't have that. If I just reset the material editor slots here, for the neck material, you can see we've got two layers here. We've got a base layer with a dirt map in the diffuse slot. All I've got for the reflection here is the occlusion map baked, just with a slight curve adjustment on it, because I want to reduce the amount of reflection in the crevice areas. The reflection glossiness, once again, is being blended with a fall off map, and then I'm compositing over the top the same reflection map. So we're darkening off the reflection in the crevices. Then from there, I've got a dust material that I'm blending over the top. And what I've done to set the dust material up is I've got the roughness slider adjusted to be slightly higher. I've enabled full reflections. I've dropped the reflection glossiness down extremely high. The Fresnel IOR is fairly low. I'm using microfacet I'm using the GGX BRDF, and with a fall off of 0.7, so much lower than usual. And what that does is it's just spreading the specular highlights quite far. You can see as I increase the roughness, We're getting a more chalky appearance, which is what I wanted. And the blend map for this is just a combination of an inverted occlusion map and the fingerprints texture, which you can see here, blended over the top. So basically I'm using the alpha from the fingerprints to blend in that dust shader. For the bump mapping, I just went online and just found a sci-fi kind of pattern that I'm using, and you can see that the texture itself, when not tiled, is fairly low res, and I've made it tileable in Photoshop. But then when you increase the tiling in 3ds Max, because things are unwrapped correctly, it ends up looking quite nice, adding just that little bit of detail to the surface to give it a more sci-fi appearance, as opposed to just being flat rubber. Another really interesting thing is that I discovered on the Facebook page that David Weaver noticed on the Chaos Group forums that there was a new OSL shader that had been implemented by Vlado for creating thin film. So basically when you get things like polarized sunglasses, you get that colored reflections bouncing off. So if I bring up Google Images, you can see here that depending on the type of thickness of that film, you end up with colored reflections based on the angle. So a big thank you to David Weaver for noticing that, because I did end up implementing that in the material itself. So that's the OSL shader is going to be included in the scene files for this, and you can see if I go into the reflection, I've loaded in a V-Ray OSL texture, and then I've loaded in the iridescence OSL file. So in this file, you've got a couple of different settings, and let me just unhide the glasses, and I'm going to duplicate this shader to kind of show you how that behaves. You can see down here that there's a minimum thickness, which is going to change the way that the reflections behave. As I go higher, we're creating a more repeated band of coloring. The only problem with this is that it's quite sensitive. So what I like to do is I'll hold down Alt when making changes to it. And you can see I'm kind of just cycling through a rainbow of colors here. And these are based on physical properties, so things in the real world. So I don't know exactly where you'd find information for this. I think you end up I personally just ended up changing the values based on kind of artistic reasons. But I guess he has set things up to behave physically correct. And it's a lot easier to adjust things here than to go in and load in a gradient ramp and then manually put the colors in. So there you go. You can have a play with that once you load up the scene files. But I thought it was really cool. And I ended up settling, because in Raphael's reference, the glasses themselves are pink. I just thought I'd blend in something a little bit more simple. You can see towards the edge it goes a little bit more yellow, but overall it's roughly a clear reflection that fades through a pink and then goes to orange. It is important to realize that when you do set up this material to turn off Fresnel reflections, because the OSL shader itself has Fresnel embedded into the settings. So you don't need to double up on that, and you can see if I click that here, we lose that physical effect. So you can turn it off and you will still get the correct reflection fall off effect. Now, if I get time, and if I can get everything in this lesson done in time, if I can get everything done in time, including the retouching, I'll quickly go in before the lesson's over and touch base on how I set up the skin shading. But at the end of the day, I wasn't really that happy with it. But there is a couple of things to notice here that have helped get things more realistic. and I have gone in ZBrush and added in some actual physical hair fibers using ZBrush's Hair and Fur. So even though the course is called Mastering V-Ray, I'm not going to touch base on this lesson how I set that stuff up, but little details like that do make all the difference. Okay, so from here I feel like I don't have much more time to run through all the different shaders in the scene. There are a couple of little things to notice, and that's that the glowing little lights I've got set up here are a V-Ray light material with direct illumination set on, and then the texture is just a simple gradient. So there's a couple of different types of those shaders I've got in, and very simply they just have a couple of colors set up in the gradient to produce that effect. Now because the V-Ray's bloom and glare works off of the color as well as the intensity, you end up with a really nice effect happening. So let me just load in you can see that on the purple areas the bloom and glare turns out purple, and then in the more yellow areas we're getting a more physically correct rainbow glare happening. Same as all the highlights as well. You can see on the edges here the bloom is pinging off red. So the next thing I want to break down is how I lit the scene. So you know how the shaders have been set up, but I haven't really up until this point in the course, and this is why that's why I'm going a little bit more in depth in this lesson, because I'm trying to tie in the Mastering Lighting course. I want to break down a couple of the theoretical approaches I have towards lighting. So what I like to do is I like to cover all of my bases. What I mean by this is that inside of V-Ray, and it is more specific to V-Ray, you've got a couple of different options when it comes to how you light an object. You'll notice that pretty much 100% of the time I rely on dome lights with V-Ray HDRIs to light the scene. But also, like I was saying at the start of the lesson, there are other benefits you get from having direct V-Ray lights, like point lights, in the scene themselves. You end up with more directional shadows, with a more controllable way to generate shadows and highlights. For example, if you're not aware, in 3ds Max there's tools you can use to align highlights on the surface. So if I go from the camera's point of view and say, for example, select this spherical light at the back here, I can use the Align tool, and if I go down here I can use the Place Highlight tool, and I can click anywhere on the surface, and what this does is it traces the normal from where you're selected, and you can pinpoint exactly where you want that light. So I've used that tool to make sure that this light is catching highlights on the upper right hand side of the mesh, and that's one way you can utilize some basic default 3ds Max tools to generate your highlights. Now also on top of that, if I drag in the composite map I've got set up here on this light, which is a new workflow for you guys, you're probably used to me just using a simple V-Ray HDRI. I've actually got a second HDRI that's been created in HDR Light Studio to generate some more specific colored reflections. So let me just load up the final beauty render. You can see that I've got a really cool red and blue contrasting colored reflection appearing in the surface, giving it that final little bit of kick. And also what this is doing is it's pulling the character off the background by enhancing the silhouette, which is a lot harder to do when you don't have real-time feedback. So in order to explain how I'm going to light things, I'll break it down how I handle things. So the first stage of this process is to make sure you're using an HDRI that gives you the overall look and feel to the image that you're trying to portray. So what I was going for in this scene and you need a clear outline of the type of look you're going for. So I knew I wanted to make everything dark and sci-fi. I didn't want to do a day scene, and I didn't want it to look indoors. I wanted it to look like the character was outdoors in the nighttime with some small pingy highlights from all over, so that all the detail in the texturing and shading that I've put in is getting picked up from every angle. Now on top of that, it's important to realize that you can't overlight an object. You need areas that are darker to pull the brighter areas off the page. So you can see the general directionality of lighting in this scene is coming from right to left. So all the light basically is coming in this direction, and you can see that through the use of the highlights, more being on the right and then the shadows on the left. But then as you go towards the rim, you are picking up a little bit of a highlight just to pull it off the page. Now, one of the biggest problems is that most people have when they're lighting things in 3D is getting that basic fundamental setup correct in terms of getting that directionality. So what I like to do is I like to set up the HDR, and you can see the HDR I've used here. I have used it at different points in the course. Is the free HDR from the SIBL website, or the HDR handbook website, and it's the Tokyo Big Sight one. And you can see if I just quickly rotate this around, it's basically got the look and feel that I was going for. Whereas an outdoor scenario with a lot of small, high intensity specular lights, causing those reflections. So when I'm lighting up a scene, the very first thing I do is I turn off all the shading effects that I've got and put an override material in to make sure that things are working as I'd expect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to override the material with that original basic V-Ray material that you saw me set up in the first scene. I'm going to drag that into the override material. I'm going to go from my camera angle, which I've set up very specifically to capture the best silhouette of this character. Because I'm also trying to capture the fact that it's a game art cover, I've gone lower on the camera. You can see as we go higher, we lose that heroic visual look. So I've gone below the character's midline. I've gone slightly off. I don't want to go directly front on. I do want the character to look like he's looking out into the distance. And if I go too far, you can see I begin to lose the silhouette of his left arm. So I wanted that to just catch up there so that you're catching the blue light and you get the contrast from red to blue on both sides of the mesh. You can see here we've got the red and the blue just catching, and then on the right side we've got the blue and the red just catching. The same goes for the neck and the chest. Every single area of the character has that contrast in color to add depth to the image. The legs are the exact same, and it takes some very specific highlight placement to get that look and feel. So like I was saying, I turn the override material on. I'm going to turn off distributed rendering just to save myself time in the saving phase, because when you have a scene that's this detailed with this many high-res textures, every time you have distributed rendering turned on, it has to save the file to the network location and start loading it, which can end up taking 30 seconds each time. Whereas I want to quickly make sure that when rotating this HDR, I can just very quickly rely on the light case preview to determine the rough placement of the orientation of the HDR. So I'm going to lower the resolution down to about 800 wide here and just hit render. And actually you can see I forgot to turn off the composite map. So let me just cancel the render, and I'm going to go into the composite map and just drag the base layer to the dome light. And I'm going to re-render this. So you can see here that the HDR from this specific angle, and I'll just let things render here. It isn't overlighting the object. However, what it is doing is it's providing some subtle color variation on the surface. We are getting a small amount of rim lighting, but the purpose of having this HDR here is to provide a rough base, to introduce a little bit of detail that's from a real world example without trying to blow out too many areas and make it more difficult to control the directionality of the light later on. So what you can do from here is, and before I do that, I'll show you an example of how incorrectly setting up the basic HDR would look like. So if I go into this base layer and rotate it, you can see if I load the preview for this HDR up, there's some main directionality coming from probably the heaviest point of the light, which is like the stall entrance. So I'm just going to rotate things. Let me just go down from a different angle now and re-render from the top to bottom. And you'll see that having the main light source on the front of the character, we lose the directionality. It makes it much harder later on to go in and create that. Also, the reflections are too overpowering right now. When you want a character to look extremely dark, it's better to use smaller light sources and let the shader itself blur the reflections. Whereas here, we're using this main big light source to bloom the whole front of the character. I can rotate this again. And now you can see rotating it once more. We lose the rim lighting. There's too much front lighting. And overall, if I were to kind of not experiment with the direction of where I wanted this light to come from, sometimes what I'll do is just to go back to that theoretical approach I was talking about, where all I want is that subtle color variation. I might go into Photoshop and hand paint out this area of the map just with the clone brush, so that I'm like manually removing that main light source, which I do quite often, and I will go into that in the mastering lighting tutorials, which will heavily rely on HDR retouching in Photoshop and HDR Light Studio. So even though the HDR here from this particular angle enhances the detail on the mesh, it's better to do that with custom hand-placed light sources. So I'll go back now and I'm going to reset the orientation of the HDR to where it was at. And before I enable the HDR Light Studio lights over the top, what I'm going to do is one by one, I'm just going to turn on some of the lights that I've built in the scene. So you can see originally in that first scene, I had that small V-Rays spherical light catching some highlights on the chest. So I'm going to turn that on, and I'm just going to turn off, because I know that from the previous tests there was no strong highlights on the front of the surface, that it's not going to really affect things by turning that off. So by doing that, the only thing that's lighting this character now is this one singular light source. And through that light placement, I'm getting that nice specular highlight on the front surface, while still getting the directionality happening, because as the light falls off towards the rim, we're creating some rounding on the surface. So those highlights are only affecting that area. And you know, as I've already finished the lesson, I'm even noticing little things I can probably do to further enhance the positioning of this light. So I'm going to cancel this render, and I'm going to move the light source just a little bit more to the right. just nudge it slightly because I am still catching a nice highlight on the biceps. So it's never too late to go in and improve things even further. I'm just going to move that a little bit more to the right and hit re-render. It's a subtle change. But I'm more happy with it now. It was just a little bit too far to the left here for my own liking. So I can cancel this. And now what I'll do from here is I want to add in this back side spherical light, which I want to capture the highlights on the shoulder. So I'm going to turn off the previous light and once again do another test render. And you have to get used to working like this because this is how a photographer deals with their own projects. So whenever you see a photographer working in a studio, a lot of the time their assistants are there for the main reason of positioning the lights for them as they're taking the photos from the camera's point of view. So you can imagine an assistant being here in real time, and that's the beauty of things happening in real time in 3D. You're getting a much easier kind of visualization of what's happening. So a photographer will stand over the camera's lens and get the assistant to and give them direction on where to move lights so that the highlights are catching exactly where they want them to be. So you can see this light on the back here is bright enough where it's pinging off these nice highlights on the surface, and it's just happening on the rim. It's not adding any kind of directionality to the surface. So that's purely to add some hotspots to be the brighter areas on the image, like here for example. So I can turn this off now. I also want another light on the back top edge to work for a similar reason, to create those pings and highlights without ruining the directionality of the front. So I'll render this off. And once again, you can see it's only affecting the very edges. Which is this light here. So there's no basic, I've never really stuck to the whole, you'll hear a lot in CG tutorials like 3-point lighting and things like that. I really don't like limiting myself to specific workflows because a lot of the time, from object to object, from camera angle to camera angle, you'll need to reposition all your lights. And that's another thing that you need to start to wrap your head around, is that photographers, when they do change camera angle, the lighting completely changes also, because the artistic side of lighting is that you are kind of trying to paint with light. You're trying to catch the edges of highlights in their most ideal positions. So I'm going to turn on all three of these point lights now to show you what they all look like in unison. And I'll just resume the recording once it renders. So I've just quickly turned off the glare effect because you can see it gets a little bit distracting. But with these 3 point lights, you can see nothing's being overlit, so I still have dark areas on the left hand side of the character, or all the angles that are facing, that are pointing out towards that left side. But what I am doing here is catching just a couple of small highlights, but I still don't have a large scale reflection coming up the surface from a V-Ray light source. So this is where I like to use, there's a couple of different methods I'll explain in the Mastering Lighting course, but in some cases I like to use, they're called Kino flow lights, and it's basically just, I'll just show you, I'll just load up Google Images. You can see here that it's just an array of tubular lights, and the power of this is that through a computer system you can change the color of the individual lights themselves. So you can go from a cool blue through to a light blue, then to a white, then to an orange, and the effect that has is that you get a nice gradient of textures, of color coming through the light source. So this scene